Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Soft Stories. I'm Stratton, and this is Pepper, and today we are going to be finishing our reading of Mary Poppins Comes Back by P. L. Travers. But before we dive right in, I have a quick question for you all. When we end this book, of course, we will begin another starting next week. And I was wondering whether you would be interested in helping me choose which book to do next. I've got quite a good set that I'd like to explore with you all eventually. But for our next book, as Pepper gets herself settled in the background, I'd like to know, would you like to read Alice's Adventures in Wonderland by Lewis Carroll, or Frankenstein by Mary Shelley? Two very different books, but ones that I have enjoyed reading myself in the past, and that I hope would be fun for us to share together. Please let me know in the comments what you'd like to read together next. The other one will pop up at some point later in the channel, I'm sure. Well, without further ado, let's dive right in to Chapter 10 of Mary Poppins Comes Back. This chapter is called Merry-Go-Round. It had been a quiet morning. More than one person passing along Cherry Tree Lane had looked over the fence of number 17 and said, "How very extraordinary! Not a sound." Even the house, which usually took no notice of anything, began to feel alarmed. "Dear me, it said to itself, listening to the silence. "I hope nothing's wrong." Downstairs in the kitchen, Mrs. Brill, with her spectacles on the tip of her nose, was nodding over the newspaper. On the first floor landing, Mrs. Banks and Ellen were tidying the linen cupboard and counting the sheets. Upstairs in the nursery, Mary Poppins was quietly clearing away the luncheon things. "I feel very good and sweet today," Jane was saying drowsily as she lay stretched on the floor in a patch of sunlight. "That must be a change," remarked Mary Poppins with a sniff. Michael took the last chocolate out of the box Aunt Flossie had given him for his 6th birthday last week. Should he offer it to Jane, he wondered, or the twins, or Mary Poppins? No, After all, it had been his birthday. "Last, lucky last," he said quickly, and popped it into his own mouth. "And I wish there were more," he added regretfully, gazing into the empty box. "All good things come to an end sometime," said Mary Poppins primly. He cocked his head on one side and looked up at her. "You don't," he said daringly, "and you're a good thing." The beginnings of a satisfied smile glimmered at the corners of her mouth, but it disappeared as quickly as it had come. "That's as may be," she retorted. "Nothing lasts forever." Jane looked round, startled. If nothing lasted forever, it meant that Mary Poppins... "Nothing," she said uneasily. "Nothing at all," snapped Mary Poppins. And as if she had guessed what was in Jane's mind, she went to the mantelpiece and took down her large thermometer. Then she pulled her carpet bag from under the camp bed and popped the thermometer into it. Jane sat up quickly. "Mary Poppins, why are you doing that?" Mary Poppins gave her a curious look. "Because," she said priggishly, "I was always taught to be tidy." And she pushed the carpet bag under the bed again. Jane sighed. Her heart felt tight and heavy in her chest. "I feel rather sad and anxious," she whispered to Michael. "I expect you had too much steamed pudding," he retorted. "No, it's not that kind of a feeling," she began, and broke off suddenly, for a knock had sounded at the door. Tap, tap. "Come in," called Mary Poppins. Robertson A. stood there, yawning. "Do you know what?" he said sleepily. "No, what?" "There's a merry-go-round in the park." "That's no news to me," snapped Mary Poppins. "A fair?" cried Michael excitedly. "With swinging boats and a hoopla?" "Nah," said Robertson A., solemnly shaking his head. "A merry-go-round, all by itself. Came last night. Thought you'd like to know." He shuffled languidly to the door and closed it after him. Jane sprang up, her anxiety forgotten. "Oh, Mary Poppins, may we go?" "Say yes, Mary Poppins, say yes," cried Michael, dancing round her. She turned, balancing a tray of plates and cups on her arm. "I am going," she remarked calmly, "because I have the fare. I don't know about you." "There's 6 pence in my money box," said Jane eagerly. "Oh, Jane, lend me 2 pence," pleaded Michael. He had spent all his money the day before on a stick of licorice. They gazed anxiously at Mary Poppins, waiting for her to make up her mind. "No borrowing or lending in the nursery, please," she said tartly. "I will pay for 1 ride each, and that is all you will have." She swept from the room, carrying the tray. They stared at each other. "What can be the matter?" said Michael. It was his turn now to be anxious. She's never paid for anything before. Aren't you well, Mary Poppins? He asked uneasily as she came hurrying back. Never better in my life, she replied, tossing her head, and now thank you, if you please, not to stand there peeking and prying at me as if I were a waxwork. Go and get ready. Her look was so stern, and her eyes so fiercely blue, and she spoke so like her usual self, that their anxiety vanished, and they ran, shouting, to get their hats. Presently the quietness of the house was broken by the noise of slamming doors, screaming voices, and stamping feet. Dear me, what a relief! I was getting quite anxious, said the house to itself, listening to Jane and Michael and the twins plunging and tumbling downstairs. Mary Poppins paused for a moment to glance at her reflection in the hall mirror. Oh, do come on, Mary Poppins, you look all right, said Michael impatiently. She wheeled about. Her expression was angry, outraged, and astonished, all at once. All right, indeed. That was hardly the word. All right, in her blue jacket with the silver buttons. All right, with her gold locket round her neck. All right, with the parrot-headed umbrella under her arm. Mary Poppins sniffed. That'll be enough from you, and more, she said shortly, though what she meant was that it wasn't nearly sufficient. But Michael was too excited to care. Come on, Jane, he cried, dancing wildly. I simply can't wait. Come on. And they ran on ahead, while Mary Poppins strapped the twins into the perambulator. And presently the garden gate clicked behind them, and they were on the way to the merry-go-round. Faint sounds of music came floating across from the park, humming and drumming like a humming-top. Good afternoon, and how are we today? Miss Lark's high voice greeted them as she hurried down the lane with her dogs. But before they had time to reply, she went on. Off to the merry-go-round, I suppose. Andrew and Willoughby and I have just been. A very superior entertainment. So nice and clean, and such a nice attendant. She fluttered past with the two dogs prancing beside her. Goodbye, goodbye, she called back over her shoulder as she disappeared round the corner. All hands to the pump. Heave-ho, my hearties. A well-known voice came roaring from the direction of the park, and through the gates came Admiral Boom, looking very red in the face, and dancing a sailor's hornpipe. Yo-ho-ho, and a bottle of rum. The Admiral's been on the merry-go-round. Bail her out, cockles and shrimps. It's as good as a long sea voyage, he roared as he greeted the children. We're going too, said Michael excitedly. What? You're going? The Admiral seemed quite astonished. Yes, of course, said Jane. But not all the way, surely. The Admiral looked curiously at Mary Poppins. They're having one ride each, sir, she explained primly. Ah, well. Farewell, he said, in a voice that, for him, was almost gentle. Then, to the children's astonishment, he drew himself up, put his hand to his forehead, and smartly saluted Mary Poppins. Rumph, he trumpeted into his handkerchief. Hoist your sail, and up with your anchor. And away, love, away. And he waved his hand and went off, rolling from side to side of the pavement and singing, "Every nice girl loves a sailor," in a loud, rumbling voice. "Why did he say farewell and call you love?" said Michael, staring after the Admiral as he walked on beside Mary Poppins. "Because he thinks I'm a thoroughly respectable person," she snapped. But there was a soft, dreamy look in her eyes. Again, Jane felt the strange, sad feeling, and her heart tightened inside her. What can be going to happen? She asked herself anxiously. She put her hand on Mary Poppins's hand as it lay on the handle of the perambulator. It felt warm and safe and comforting. "How silly I am," she said softly. "There can't be anything wrong." And she hurried beside the perambulator as it trundled towards the park. Just a moment, just a moment," a panting voice sounded behind them. "Why," said Michael, turning, "it's Miss Tartlet." "Indeed it is not," said Miss Tartlet breathlessly. "It's Mrs. Turvey." She turned, blushing, to Mr. Turvey. He stood beside her, smiling a little sheepishly. "Is this one of your second Mondays?" Jane inquired. He was right side up, so she did not think it could be. "Oh, no, thank goodness, no," he said, hastily. "We, were just coming to say, oh, good afternoon, Mary." "Well, Cousin Arthur?" They all shook hands. "I wondered if you were going on the merry-go-round," he inquired. "Yes, I am. We all are." "All?" Mr. Turvey's eyebrows shot up to the top of his head. He seemed very surprised. "They're going for one ride each," said Mary Poppins, nodding at the children. "Sit still, please," she snapped at the twins, who had bobbed up excitedly. "You're not performing mice." "Oh, I see. And then they're getting off. Well, goodbye, Mary, and bon voyage." Mr. Turvey raised his hat high above his head, very ceremoniously. "Goodbye, and thank you for coming," said Mary Poppins, bowing graciously to Mr. and Mrs. Turvey. "What does bon voyage mean?" said Michael, looking over his shoulder at the retreating figures. Mrs. Turvey very fat and curly, Mr. Turvey very straight and thin. "A good journey, which is something you won't have unless you walk up," snapped Mary Poppins. He hurried after her. The music was louder now, beating and drumming on the air, drawing them all towards it. Mary Poppins, almost running, turned the perambulator in at the park gates. But there a row of pavement pictures caught her eye, and she pulled up suddenly. "What is she stopping for now?" said Michael, in his angry whisper to Jane. "We'll never get there at this rate." The pavement artist had just completed a set of fruit in coloured chalks: an apple, a pear, a plum, and a banana. Underneath them, he was busy chalking the words, "Take one." said Mary Poppins, with a ladylike cough. The pavement artist leapt to his feet and Jane and Michael saw that it was Mary Poppins's great friend, the matchman. "Mary, at last! I've been waiting all day." The matchman seized her by both hands and gazed admiringly into her eyes. Mary Poppins looked very shy and rather pleased. "Well, Bert, we're off to the merry-go-round," she said, blushing. "I thought you would be. They going with you?" he added, jerking his thumb at the children. Mary Poppins shook her head mysteriously. "Just for a ride," she said quickly. "Oh." He pursed up his mouth. "I see." Michael stared. What else could they do on a merry-go-round except go for a ride, he wondered. "A nice set of pictures you've got," Mary Poppins was saying admiringly, gazing down at the fruit. "Help yourself," said the matchman airily. And with that, Mary Poppins, before their astonished eyes, bent down and picked the painted plum from the pavement and took a bite out of it. "Won't you take one?" said the matchman, turning to Jane. She stared at him. "But can I?" It seemed so impossible. "Try." She bent towards the apple, and it leapt into her hand. She bit into the red side. It tasted very sweet. "But how do you do it?" said Michael, staring. "I don't," said the matchman. "It's her." He nodded at Mary Poppins as she stood primly beside the perambulator. "It only happens when she's around, I assure you." Then he bent down and picked the pear clean out of the pavement and offered it to Michael. "But what about you?" said Michael, for though he wanted the pear, he also wanted to be polite. "That's all right," said the matchman. "I can always take more." And with that he plucked the banana, peeled it, and gave half each to the twins. A clear, sweet strain of music came floating urgently to their ears. "Now, Bert, we really must be going," said Mary Poppins hurriedly, as she neatly hid her plumstone between two park railings. "Must you, Mary?" said the matchman very sadly. "Well, goodbye, my dear, and good luck." "But you'll see him again, won't you?" said Michael, as he followed Mary Poppins through the gates. "Maybe, and maybe not," she said shortly, "and it's no affair of yours." Jane turned and looked back. The matchman was standing by his box of chalks, gazing with all his eyes after Mary Poppins. "This is a curious day," she said, frowning. Mary Poppins glared at her. "What's wrong with it, pray?" "Well, everyone's saying goodbye, and looking at you so strangely." "Speech costs nothing," snapped Mary Poppins, "and a cat can look at a king, I suppose." Jane was silent. She knew it was no good saying anything to Mary Poppins, because Mary Poppins never explained. She sighed, and because she was not quite sure why she sighed, she began to run, streaking past Michael and Mary Poppins and the perambulator towards the thundering music. "Wait for me! Wait for me!" screamed Michael, dashing after her. And behind him came the rumbling trundle of the perambulator, as Mary Poppins hurried after them both. There stood the merry-go-round, on a clear patch of lawn between the lime trees. It was a new one, very bright and shiny, with prancing horses going up and down on their brass poles. A striped flag fluttered from the top, and everywhere it was gorgeously decorated with golden scrolls and silver leaves and coloured birds and stars. It was, in fact, everything Miss Lark had said, and more. The merry-go-round slowed up and drew to a standstill as they arrived. The park keeper ran up officiously and held on to one of the brass poles. Come along, threepence a ride," he called importantly. "I know which horse I'll have," said Michael, dashing up to one painted blue and scarlet with the name Merrylegs on its gold collar. He clambered onto its back and seized the pole. "No litter allowed, and observe the bylaws," called the keeper fussily, as Jane sped past him. "I'll have Twinkle," she cried, climbing upon the back of a fiery white horse with its name on a red collar. Then Mary Poppins lifted the twins from the perambulator and put Barbara in front of Michael and John behind Jane. "Penny, twopenny, threepenny, fourpenny, or fivepenny rides?" said the merry-go-round attendant, as he came to collect the money. "Sixpenny," said Mary Poppins, handing him 4 sixpenny bits. The children stared, amazed. They had never before had a 6-penny ride on a merry-go-round. "No litter allowed," called the keeper, his eyes on the tickets in Mary Poppins's hands. "But aren't you coming?" said Michael, calling down to her. "Hold tight, please. Hold tight. I'll take the next turn," she replied snappily. There was a hoot from the merry-go-round's chimney. The music broke out again, and slowly, the horses began to move. "Hold on, please," called Mary Poppins sternly. They held on. The trees were moving past them. The brass poles slipped up and down through the horses' backs. A dazzle of light fell on them from the rays of the setting sun. "Sit tight," came Mary Poppins's voice again. They sat tight. Now the trees were moving more swiftly, spinning about them as the merry-go-round gathered speed. Michael tightened his arm about Barbara's body. Jane flung back her hand and held John firmly. On they rode, turning ever more quickly, with their hair blowing out behind them and the wind sharp on their faces. Round and round went Merrylegs and Twinkle, with the children on their backs, and the park tipping and rocking, whirling and wheeling about them. It seemed as if they would never stop, as if there were no such thing as time, as if the world was nothing but a circle of light and a group of painted horses. The sun died in the west, and the dusk came fluttering down. But still they rode, faster and faster, till at last they could not distinguish tree from sky. The whole broad earth was spinning now about them, with a deep drumming sound, like a humming top. Never again would Jane and Michael and John and Barbara be so close to the centre of the world as they were on that whirling ride. And somehow, it seemed, they knew it. For never again was the thought in their hearts as the earth whirled about them and they rode through the dropping dusk. Presently the trees ceased to be a circular green blur, and their trunks again became visible. The sky moved away from the earth, and the park stopped spinning. Slower and slower went the horses, and at last the merry-go-round stood still. Come along, threepence a ride," the park keeper was calling in the distance. Stiff from their long ride, the 4 children clambered down, but their eyes were shining and their voices trembled with excitement. "Oh, lovely, lovely, lovely," cried Jane, gazing at Mary Poppins with sparkling eyes as she put John into the perambulator. "If only we could have gone on forever," exclaimed Michael, lifting Barbara in beside him. Mary Poppins gazed down at them. Her eyes were strangely soft and gentle in the gathering dusk. "All good things come to an end," she said for the second time that day. Then she flung up her head and glanced at the merry-go-round. "My turn," she cried joyfully as she stooped and took something from the perambulator. Then she straightened and stood looking at them for a moment, that strange look that seemed to plunge right down inside them and see what they were thinking. "Michael," she said, lightly touching his cheek with her hand, "be good." He stared up at her uneasily. Why had she done that? What could be the matter? "Jane, take care of Michael and the twins," said Mary Poppins, and she lifted Jane's hand and put it gently on the handle of the perambulator. All aboard, cried the ticket collector. The lights of the merry-go-round blazed up. Mary Poppins turned. "Coming," she called, waving her parrot-headed umbrella. She darted across the little gulf of darkness that lay between the children and the merry-go-round. "Mary Poppins!" cried Jane, with a tremble in her voice. For suddenly, she did not know why, she felt afraid. "Mary Poppins!" shouted Michael, catching Jane's fear. But Mary Poppins took no notice. She leapt gracefully upon the platform, and climbing upon the back of a dappled horse called Caramel, she sat down, neatly and primly. And here we can see Mary Poppins riding side saddle on Caramel, her chin in the air and her umbrella in her hand, all things as they should be. "Single or return?" said the ticket collector. For a moment she appeared to consider the question. She glanced across at the children and back at the collector. "You never know," she said thoughtfully. "It might come in useful. I'll take a return." The ticket collector snapped a hole in a green ticket and handed it to Mary Poppins. Jane and Michael noticed that she did not pay for it. The music broke out again, softly at first, and then loudly, wildly, triumphantly. Slowly the painted horses began to move. Mary Poppins, looking straight ahead of her, was borne past the children, the parrot's head of her umbrella nestled under her arm. Her neatly gloved hands were closed on the brass pole, and in front of her, on the horse's neck, "Michael!" cried Jane, clutching his arm. "Do you see? She must have hidden it under the rug. Her carpet bag." Michael stared. "Do you think—" he began in a whisper. Jane nodded. "But she's wearing the locket. The chain hasn't broken. I distinctly saw it." Behind them the twins began to whimper, but Jane and Michael took no notice. They were gazing anxiously at the shining circle of horses. The merry-go-round was moving swiftly now, and soon the children could no longer tell which horse was which, nor distinguish merry legs from Twinkle. Everything before them was a blaze of spinning light, except for the dark figure, neat and steady, that ever and again approached them and sped past and disappeared. Wilder and wilder grew the drumming music. Faster and faster whirled the merry-go-round. Again the dark shape rode towards them upon the dappled horse, and this time, as she came by, something bright and gleaming broke from her neck and came flying through the air to their feet. Jane bent and picked it up. It was the gold locket, hanging loosely from its broken golden chain. "It's true, then. It's true," came Michael's bursting cry. "Oh, open it, Jane." With trembling fingers she pressed the catch, and the locket flew open. The flickering light fell across the glass, and they saw before them their own painted faces, clustered about a figure with straight black hair, stern blue eyes, bright pink cheeks, and a nose turning upwards like the nose of a Dutch doll. Jane, Michael, John, Barbara, and Annabel Banks, and Mary Poppins, read Jane from the little scroll beneath the picture. "So that's what was in it," said Michael miserably, as Jane shut the locket and put it in her pocket. He knew there was no hope now. They turned again to the merry-go-round, dazzled and giddy in the spinning light, for by now the horses were flying more swiftly than ever, and the pealing music was louder than before. And then a strange thing happened. With a great blast of trumpets, the whole merry-go-round rose, spinning from the ground. Round and round, rising ever higher, the coloured horses wheeled and raced, with Caramel and Mary Poppins at their head. And the swinging circle of light went lifting among the trees, turning the leaves to gold as the light fell upon them. "She's going," said Michael. "Oh, Mary Poppins, come back, come back," they cried, lifting their arms towards her, but her face was turned away. She looked out serenely above her horse's head and gave no sign that she had heard. "Mary Poppins!" It was a last, despairing cry. No answer now came from the air. By now the merry-go-round had cleared the trees and was whirling up towards the stars. Away it went, and away, growing smaller and smaller, until the figure of Mary Poppins was but a dark speck in a wheel of light. On and on, pricking through the sky, went the merry-go-round, carrying Mary Poppins with it. And, at last, it was just a tiny twinkling shape, a little larger, but not otherwise different from a star. Michael sniffed and fumbled for his handkerchief. "I've got a crick in my neck," he said, to explain the sniff. But when she was not looking, he hurriedly wiped his eyes. Jane, still watching the bright spinning shape, gave a little sigh. Then she turned away. "We must go home," she said flatly, remembering that Mary Poppins had told her to take care of Michael and the twins. Come along. Threepence a ride." The park keeper, who had been putting litter in the baskets, returned to the scene. He glanced at where the merry-go-round had been and started violently. He looked around him and his mouth fell open. He looked up and his eyes nearly burst out of his head. "See here," he said. "This won't do. Here one minute and gone the next. It's against regulations. I'll have the law on you." He shook his fist wildly at the empty air. "I never saw such a thing, not even when I was a boy. I must make a report. I shall tell the Lord Mayor." Silently the children turned away. The merry-go-round had left no trace in the grass, not a dent in the clover. Except for the park keeper, who stood there shouting and waving his arms, the green lawn was quite empty. "She took a return," said Michael, walking slowly beside the perambulator. "Do you think that means she'll come back?" Jane thought for a moment. "Perhaps. If we want her enough," she said slowly. "Yes, perhaps," he repeated, sighing a little, and said no more till they were back in the nursery. I say! Mr. Banks came running up the path and burst in at the front door. "Hi, where's everybody?" he shouted, running up the stairs 3 at a time. "Whatever is the matter?" said Mrs. Banks, hurrying out to meet him. "The most wonderful thing!" he cried, flinging open the nursery door. "A new star has appeared. I heard about it on the way home, the largest ever. I've borrowed Admiral Boom's telescope to look at it. Come and see." He ran to the window and clapped the telescope to his eye. Yes, he said, hopping excitedly. "There it is, a wonder, a beauty, a marvel, a gem. See for yourself." He handed Mrs. Banks the telescope. "Children," he shouted, "there's a new star." I know, began Michael, but it's not really a star. It's... You know? And it isn't. What on earth do you mean? Take no notice. He's just being silly, said Mrs. Banks. Now, where is this star? Oh, I see. Very pretty. Quite the brightest in the sky. I wonder where it came from. Now, children. She gave the telescope, in turn, to Jane and Michael, and as they looked through the glass they could see the circle of painted horses, the brass poles, and the dark blur that ever and again whirled across their sight for a moment and was gone. They turned to each other and nodded. They knew what the dark blur was, a neat, trim figure in a blue coat with silver buttons and a stiff straw hat on its head, and a parrot-headed umbrella under its arm. Out of the sky she had come, back to the sky she had gone. And Jane and Michael would not explain to anyone, for they knew there were things about Mary Poppins that could never be explained. A knock sounded at the door. "Excuse me, ma'am," said Mrs. Brill, hurrying in very red in the face, "but I think you ought to know that there Mary Poppins has gone again." "Gone?" said Mrs. Banks, unbelievingly. "Lock, stock, and barrow. Gone," said Mrs. Brill triumphantly, "without a word or by your leave. Just like last time. Even her camp bed and her carpet bag. Clean gone. Not even a postcard album as a memento. So there." "Dear, dear," said Mrs. Banks. "How very tiresome. How thoughtless. How and... George." She turned to Mr. Banks. "George, Mary Poppins has gone." "Who? What? Mary Poppins? Well, never mind that. We've got a new star." "A new star won't wash and dress the children," said Mrs. Banks crossly. "It will look through their window at night," cried Mr. Banks happily. "That's better than washing and dressing." He turned back to the telescope. "Won't you, my wonder, my marvel, my beauty?" he said, looking up at the star. Jane and Michael drew close and leant against him, gazing across the window-sill into the evening air, and high above them the great shape circled and wheeled through the darkening sky, shining and keeping its secret for ever and ever and ever. And that, my friends, is the end of Mary Poppins Comes Back by P.L. Travers. I hope you have enjoyed going through this book with me. This is the first time I've read this sequel to the original Mary Poppins, and I enjoyed it greatly. Thank you so much for sticking with this reading. I look forward to seeing you again soon and discovering what next we'll be reading together. Please do chime in if you have thoughts about books that you'd like me to read on the channel. I'm always open to new ideas. Thank you again, once more, and I shall see you soon. But until next we meet, just like Mary Poppins, I will wish you all the best, and goodbye.